the most generous introduction, ladies and gentlemen. That is the warmest welcome I've ever had. I tell you, we members of the European Parliament are not normally received in this way. We MEPs are not the most popular people in our home countries, believe me. You don't all have to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. I've become accustomed to this over the years. I must tell you, though, a story about one of my colleagues in the European Parliament, who is the only one who always is recognised, who has instant name recall wherever he speaks, and that is a Christian Democrat colleague of mine from Luxembourg, who glories in the name of Mr. Goebbels. Now, Mr. Goebbels has no difficulty being remembered, and I promise you this is a true story. I'll never forget the first time he rose to speak. The man in the speaker's chair was a British Labour MEP called David Martin. And when he saw that Goebbels was the next name on the speaker list, he began to get very agitated. I don't know if any of you have seen our British comedy series Fawlty Towers, the great Don't Mention the War sketch. Well, that was, you could see the Don't Mention the War thing going through David Martin's face, and he saw the name Goebbels getting closer and closer, and he was visibly saying to himself, don't mention the war. By the time it finally got to poor Mr. Goebbels, so to speak, he was so agitated, he said, I now call Mr. Goering. I mean, Dr. Goebbels. I mean, Mr. Goebbels. For the rest of us, it's wonderful to get any kind of platform anywhere, so thank you very much, Andrew and Kate and the Young Americans Foundation. And thank you particularly for bringing me to sunny California, where the skies are always blue. Do you know, I'm beginning to realise that this whole thing is a sort of marketing scam by the and it's a very old marketing scam. In 1812, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend in Europe, and he said, among other things, he made the rather curious observation, your skies in Europe are always cloudy, ours are always cloudless. Well, as I looked up today, I thought, a liberal might put this down to radical climate change. I think it's more likely that your third president is giving in to justifiable patriotism and perhaps a little exuberance in revelling in this country. But it's been a very important and moving day for me today. It's been an ambition of mine for a long time to come to this part of the world and to see Ronald Reagan's ranch. He was, if anyone's face belongs on Mount Rushmore, it's that of your portrait. He was, of course, a good friend to us. He was a staunch ally of Margaret Thatcher's when we found ourselves at war in the Falklands. In marked contrast, I'm sorry to say, to his current successor, who has lined up with some deeply unpleasant and anti-American figures in pressing Argentina's claim. Your Secretary of State was in Buenos Aires and couldn't even bring herself to call the islands the Falkland Islands. She used the Argentine name, Malvinas. Thereby lining up with Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and these great democratic figures, these little tin pot caudillos around the world, against the one country that is deploying troops in serious numbers, in strength, in Afghanistan alongside your soldiers. But he wasn't just a friend to us. He was a friend to democracy, a friend to freedom. You can learn a great deal about a man by the way in which he chose to live. And walking around the Reagan Ranch today, I thought, this is the kind of politician that the founders envisaged. A man who would never allow his office to go to his head, who would return as Cincinnatus to his plough and take succour from the simple scenery of a Californian ranch. And you know, that simplicity is the great strength of Ronald Reagan. There is such a thing in politics as being too clever. His detractors always used to attack him as a simpleton. You'll all remember this. You know, in the days when he was the idiot cowboy, he was Ronald Reagan, he was the Hollywood man who could read somebody else's lines, but was brainless. Well, on the narrow charge of not being intelligent, I think that was blown out of the water by the publication of Reagan in His Own Hand, when we saw the annotations he'd made to the radio broadcasts he made as governor. Clearly here was a very lively intelligence. But there was perhaps a little nugget of truth in the idea that there was something simple about him. What I mean by that is that he didn't ever allow himself to be distracted. He set out as president with one big idea abroad, which was to defeat the Soviet Union, and one big idea at home, which was to cut taxes. And although all sorts of events and all sorts of people tried to pull him off his course, what he remained was that founder's ideal of a politician, a simple patriot who stuck to what he promised and delivered on both counts. He delivered freeing hundreds of millions from tyranny across the world, and of course he delivered the biggest tax cut in the history of this country. And there I think there is a lesson which is apt to our present age. Sometimes, to cheer myself up, I watch the various YouTube compilations of Ronald Reagan's greatest lines. And in a very crowded field of good lines, one of my favourites is where he was asked about the deficit by a hostile journalist. And he replied in that amiable way he had, "Oh, I don't worry about the deficit. It's big enough to look after itself." And of course what he was driving at is that if his gamble of the tax cuts paid off, the deficit would look after itself, because the best way of getting rid of a deficit is through growth. And the way of engendering economic growth is not by raising taxes, but by lowering them so as to stimulate enterprise. Now, I think it's probably true, it's fair enough, that that didn't happen during the Reagan years. The legacy of the Reagan tax cuts came later. The chief beneficiary of them, paradoxically, was Bill Clinton. But he proved the point that if you cut taxes, then that will eventually stimulate the economy in such a way that the deficit is cured not by taking money out of the private sector or out of people's pockets, but by allowing it to shrink as a size of the overall economy. And there, I think, is something that your candidates for office in a couple of weeks' time would profit from the study of. When we talk about stimulus packages putting money into the economy, we have reversed the reality. What a stimulus package does is it takes money out of the economy and concentrates it in the hands of a government bureaucracy. And then as it expands that bureaucracy, it takes individuals out of productive work and puts them in relatively unproductive roles. The biggest stimulus you can have is a tax cut. So thank you, all of you, for what you are doing to preserve the legacy of a great California and an American who embodied the spirit of his nation. And thank you for teaching a young generation that they are the inheritors of a great tradition. There is almost nothing so valuable as the work that the Young Americas Foundation does in terms of communicating to people, to young people in this country, that they are not simply a random set of individuals born to another random set of individuals, but that they are the guardians, the custodians of a great tradition. Now, as I came here, I arrived in the US yesterday, I was troubled by strikes in France, which is a very common experience. France is now experiencing a series of rolling strikes and protests in opposition to President Sarkozy's wicked proposal to raise the retirement age to 36 or 37. And you know, there was a thing on the news as I was waiting in the airport, fuming, wondering whether I was going to be able to overfly the place. And I was looking at the banners, and the two that particularly stuck in my mind were, "Let's paralyze the economy," and my particular favourite, "Strike till you retire," which of course is not very long under the current Now,